ever wonder what therapists talk about over coffee? Well, we're three clinical psychologists, Dr. Diana Hill, Dr. Ray Littlewood, and Dr. Debbie Sorensen, and we'd like to welcome you to Psychologists Off the Clock. In this podcast, you'll get a glimpse into the books we read, the research we think is interesting, and the ideas from psychology that we use to thrive in our own lives. Our webpage is www.offtheclockpsych.com, and there you can find resources we mention in this episode as well as other podcasts we've posted. You can also find us on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Dr. Diana Hill, and I'm here talking with Dr. Elizabeth Boyer, who is a sports psychologist in Seattle, Washington, and I'm really excited to talk with you today.
I'm excited to be here.
How is it in Seattle?
It's good.
Yeah. Is it rainy and all those stories that they say about it?
It is. It's cold, and most people are looking for a place to run away to the sunshine right about now. Yeah. But when it's sunny, it's so beautiful with the snow-capped mountains, and so it's been beautiful as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to talk with you about the topic of sports psychology, which is an area of psychology that I have so little experience in, and want to learn more, and am interested about what your life looks like on a day-to-day basis and working with athletes and teams, and also some of the challenges and some of the cutting-edge practices that you use in your practice. So I'm excited. Dr. Elizabeth Boyer is in private practice at Northwest Performance Psychology in Seattle, Washington. She's a licensed psychologist and certified sports psychology consultant, and she's really committed to helping individuals maximize their potential enjoyment in life. She's worked with individuals and teams from youth recreational to elite and professional levels, and works on enhancing performance, team efficacy, cohesion, and overall well-being. She has a special professional and research interest in the benefits of sports participation and physical activity for women and girls, and works and serves as on the advisory board for Z Girls, which is a nonprofit organization working to empower young girls in sport. And she has a history of herself being an athlete. She was competed as a gymnast in the Seattle suburb of Bellevue, and then coached at Bellevue High School gymnastics for 4 seasons prior to moving into the arena of sports psychology. So she received her BS in psychology at University of Washington, coming back home there to Seattle.
Yes.
And then had her master's in education in counseling and developmental studies with an emphasis in sports psychology at Boston University, followed by her PhD at University of North Texas with, again, an emphasis in sports psychology. And then where I met Liz was at UC Davis, where she completed her postdoctoral fellowship and then went on to be the coordinator of applied sports psychology program there. And how many years did you work at UC Davis after postdoc?
After postdoc, I think it was there 3 years.
3 years, okay. So working with the teams there at UC Davis and coordinating also the sports psychology training program as well.
Yes.
So as I mentioned, I met you when I was on internship. And so in the field of psychology, when you're getting your doctorate, on the way you do your years at the university where you're getting your doctorate from, but then you go on a year-long internship before you get your degree. And I was doing that at UC Davis and working in the eating disorder emphasis area, where I met Liz working in sports psychology on her postdoc. And it was one of my best years ever, in part because of you. I loved it. It was so fun being with you there. So it's always been kind of a curious thing. What is sports psychology? And maybe you can just sort of describe to me, starting with, what is it that you do as a sports psychologist that may be different from a traditional psychologist?
Sure. Sports psychology is really a really vast profession. I mean, it covers quite a bit of different aspects of the athletic experience. And so not only does it cover topics that looks at the psychological factors that are a part of participating in sport and contribute to great performances, but it also looks at what are the benefits to the overall person and developmental benefits that you might get from participation in sport. So we think about teamwork and leadership skills and being able to bounce back from mistakes. Some of those are skills that get to be developed within a healthy sport environment. And then there's also all kinds of psychological consequences that result in participation in sport, and that can be related to disordered eating and injury and burnout, transitions that occur, moving up levels or moving out of sport that can cause some kind of distress for individuals. So there's a clinical component as well in working with athletes because they're experiencing something on a clinical basis that's related to their sport.
So as a sports psychologist, are the athletes considered your client, or is the team your client, or the coach, or how does that work in terms of, I'm also thinking about confidentiality and issues around that. If I can't see two friends, how can you see two teammates and keep confidentiality? I mean, that seems like that'd be really a challenge.
It is a real challenge. And the answer to the first question is, who's the client?
Yeah.
Is sort of everyone, It depends on how you're working with a team or who's hiring you. So when I was at the university, college setting, I'm serving the athlete population, but I'm also there as a support resource to the coaches and athletic staff. I was also there to provide trainings and education to the athletic staff on issues that are, important to athletes and their psychological well-being. And so sometimes, and then I was also there to help teams perform well too, or maybe just maybe there was something going on within the team dynamic, or maybe there was some need for increasing, maybe the cultural competence and making it a safer environment for everybody on the team. So there's lots of different ways that you can be helping and working within athletic environment, an organization. And if I was there to help with a team's performance, the team is my client as a whole. All of the athletes are individual potential clients as well. And then the coaches. And so you brought up the idea of confidentiality and multiple relationships. That does get tricky because it would be completely possible that I would have two different individual athletes on my caseload who are both teammates, who might even be in competition for the same role or position on the team, and is there to enhance of their experiences and for them to be able to be as consistent and confident as possible, and yet knowing that it's very real that I'm also working with another person. So and that they would know that, they might know that I'm working with both of them because they've talked or that they just know that that's a possibility. And so that's definitely something that gets talked about when we're first starting a relationship with a team. Here are all the different ways that I can be a resource, and this is all the different ways, that then these are some things to think about. And
what about confidentiality between the team athletes and the coach? Because that seems like that would be something that, say an athlete was struggling with eating disorder and they don't want necessarily their coach to know about that, or they're struggling with the substance use, or is that usually set up ahead of time that you hold that confidentiality, or are there some areas outside of like risk to yourself that you'd have to break confidentiality? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the way I've worked is I set that up ahead of time and let the coach know, or it might be the performance development director, depending on what kind of a team it is. But I'll let them know that my first priority is to the athlete's well-being. And so my first priority is maintaining confidentiality with the athletes, with the individual athletes, because if they think I'm going to share everything with the coach, then they're not going to come to me, and I'm not going to be helpful to anybody. And usually the coaches understand that, and I'll let them know, if there's something that I think is really important that you need to know, always try to empower the athlete to share that information with the coach directly. Um, and if there's something that the coach asks me about and is trying to get, answers around, I'll refer them back to the athlete and say that's like, it sounds like maybe you want to have a good conversation with the athlete, but that I will not break confidentiality.
It sounds similar to when you're working maybe with a adult child, like a college student child and their parents, and they want, they're paying for treatment, but you have the confidentiality and they're calling you asking how their child is doing. That same kind of line that you can hold, and always referring back to talking directly to the client themselves. And
I think there are some situations, disordered eating is one in particular where, you definitely want to be aware of the injury risk that is there as well. And so I'm always trying to advocate, health and well-being and sharing that with the athlete. And this is my concern. And this is why I think it would be good for you to talk with your coach about this, and always trying to allow them to be the one to disclose information. And I won't disclose information if they don't want to.
Since you're on the topic of disordered eating, can you speak a little bit to the female athlete triad, which is something that's spoken about a lot, and also just how disordered eating shows up in sport and maybe how it's different than disordered eating outside of sport?
Yeah, there's some belief that, or even some research to show that athletes might have some protective factors from engaging in disordered eating, because we find that there might be higher levels of confidence and self-esteem and other things that might be protective for against developing an eating disorder. And then there's also unique aspects of the athletic environment that can actually increase the risk of developing disordered eating. And this is for both females and males. And I do think that that's an important point, is research and our interventions have sort of ignored the male experience up and more recently. So that's something we're needing to pay more attention to. But the natural sort of competitiveness and perfectionism and some of the personality characteristics that help athletes excel and get a lot of reinforcement from coaches can be the kinds of factors that might increase the risk of engaging in disordered eating. And coaches don't really realize that because they're so excited that they're putting in this extra effort, or they're doing extra workouts, or they're being hypercritical and wanting to improve, and that continues to get reinforced with praise and rewards, and yet it might be reinforcing a maladaptive pattern or style. So that's maybe one way that coaches miss what's actually going on for the athlete. We know that there are sports that there's a perceived and a real benefit to having a certain aesthetic look, a certain body type. And so those sports like synchronized swimming or gymnastics or ice skating might be more at risk because as a performance benefit to maintain a particular weight or maintain a particular look, and coaches can buy into that, promote that kind of belief, and then that there are sports that have uniforms that are more revealing. We find that increases negative body image, and there's some activism around that for some sports, but there's maybe not a need, for example, for women's volleyball to wear hip hugger, because there doesn't seem to be a performance need or benefit to that. We don't see the men wearing body hugging volleyball uniforms. So if there was a performance benefit, we would certainly see males doing that. But so there's certain components to the sport environment that I think can increase that risk. And then there's practices as well, like weigh-ins and measuring body mass and things that can increase their anxiety or their chance of dieting or engaging in some kind of compensation.
Can you speak to the female athlete triad piece in terms of what that is? Because I know that's mentioned a lot in when people are talking about sports and eating disorders.
Yeah, and I think we need to talk more about it, actually. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So the female athlete triad is when a female athlete is out of balance in terms of their energy availability, so that they're expending more calories and more energy than they're taking in. And when they do that, then they're at risk of going into or having that contribute to menstrual dysfunction and might have a loss of period or be amenorrheic. And yet then that can increase the chance of losing bone density. And that then puts them at a risk of injury. Yeah. And so all these factors are, it's like a triangle. That's why they call it the triad. All three of those are factors that are interrelated and affecting each other. And so sometimes if an athlete is engaging in disordered eating, then they have a lower energy availability than is required for their sport. And then they can become amenorrheic and be losing some bone density, losing the calcium, and they can be at risk for an injury. But we also find that some athletes don't realize that they're not taking in enough calories, and that happens accidentally. I think for any practitioner, it's important to ask questions. If you have an athlete on your caseload, it's just ask some questions about menstrual functioning, because there's a real myth out there that well, if you don't have a period as an athlete, that means you're working really hard. And they used to think that actually it was because of the body mass index was too low, and that triggered the amenorrhea, but it's actually the energy availability being too low. So it's not about body mass, but it's about how many calories they're expending compared to what they're taking in.
Thank you so much for speaking to that, Liz, because many a time I've had a client that is struggling with an eating disorder and in a normal weight range, but not getting their period. And maybe doing a lot of, like, maybe they're running a lot or doing, exercising a lot or expending a lot of energy. And that may be part of what's contributing to that. And there's this myth out there that you lose your period if you're, one that if you have your period, then you don't have an eating disorder, which is a myth, you know. But then two, if you don't have your period, but you're within a normal weight range, that doesn't really matter. Oh, good, I just don't get my period. As opposed to this is really being a sign that there's something going on physiologically in your body that is saying, okay, this is not healthy. What you're doing, your body's saying it's overstressed, and so therefore it will not menstruate. And there's downstream effects for that later on if you don't have that bone density, as well as during, if you're an athlete, and you're jumping off of things and, landing hard on your bones, that could be pretty risky as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I think coaches reinforce, like they might see it as, oh, that's a good thing. You're working hard enough to not have your period, like that it's some indicator of that's normal, because that's what happens when you're just training this much. But I always share with people, well, actually that's a signal that something's wrong, rather than something's right. And I think that's real, something that really has to shift in the minds of parents and coaches, that's a signal that you're training correctly. That's actually a signal that something is incorrect. Something's wrong. Your body's saying, I have to shut down certain mechanisms here because I have to conserve energy. And that, like you said, has longer term effects on the body in other ways. But we also see that there's an effect on performance. And so some interesting research actually that UC Davis was doing in their sports med and exercise physiology program that was looking at the ways that amenorrheic female runners were able to finish races compared to those who have regular menstrual functioning, and that there's something about not having your menstrual functioning that keeps the adrenaline, that extra kick that you need at the end of a race, for example, from being able to be released.
Wow.
And so that actually could have not just health, and of course we're more concerned about the health, but that there's also a performance consequence.
Yeah.
And that's important, because then that speaks more volume to the coaches.
Right.
And so that's a way to get them
better selling point there, right?
Concerned about this.
Yeah.
Yes, but I always ask about menstrual functioning with everybody that I meet with, and explain why. And I always refer to a nutritionist as well, just to make sure that they're getting the proper nutrition that athletes need to help keep them, healthy from injury, and to also try to help prevent them from developing disordered eating habits as they're trying to regulate it on their own.
So that's one area that you really have specialty in, and I know that when we were working at UC Davis together, we worked together and had some overlap in the area of eating disorders, which was really fun. I think we led some workshops together, body image workshops and other things. And it feels like such an important specialty to have in the area of sport, because I imagine there's a lot of sports psychologists that don't have the background in training in eating disorders and maybe can't spot what you can spot or know the appropriate, questions to ask around that and referrals to make. And then the other area that it seems like you're getting more interested in is around injury. We were talking a bit about that, of having an interest in athletes and injury. So what are you doing there? What's your interest there, and what kind of work are you doing in that area?
Well, and I think that they're so related to the disordered eating, because we know that, if you're engaging in disordered eating, then you're at higher risk for an injury. But also, injured athletes are at a higher risk of developing an eating disorder as part of the response to injury. Because what can happen is athletes are out of practice, their schedule has changed quite a bit, the intensity of their training, and so then they might start to either engage in some kind of disordered eating habits as part of their coping mechanism with the stress and reaction to the injury, or to the pain, or to the trauma, whatever that was, how that injury occurred. But then they also might use compensatory behaviors because they're not able to work out as much, and they get fears about gaining weight, and try to manage their weight in that way as well. So it's a risky time.
Yeah.
And what led me to be more interested in supporting athletes who are injured is I just feel like there's a real lack of services that we provide in this area. It seems there's so much opportunity to support athletes in different ways. And so one way is really to help educate physical therapists and help them kind of look for signs and symptoms of, some negative reactions to the injury or the rehab process. So things that I've already mentioned, maybe engaging in some kind of maladaptive coping, but maybe development of depression or anxiety, listening for loss of confidence, being afraid of the pain, and so then not rehabbing, sticking to their rehab regimen. So I think there's ways we can, as sports psychologists, can help educate and empower physical therapists to provide some more listening, referrals to the athletes that they're working with. I think there's a lot of opportunity to incorporate the same mental skills that we teach athletes for enhanced performances, to incorporate that into their rehab.
Do you have an example of that? Of what would be a skill you teach?
Doing some relaxation exercises or some mindfulness exercises even before you go into rehab, so that you're more able to be more relaxed. You might be able to handle the pain a little bit more, tolerate the pain, which might lead you to more reps, more extension as you're getting your treatments done. Might increase your adherence to going if you're quite as anxious, or you don't experience it to be as painful or distressing. I love to try to have athletes use imagery. So imagery or visualization is a more common term for it, but we teach athletes to really imagine their physical skills or being in an athletic setting, practicing seeing themselves being successful, or practicing themselves learning a new technique or a new skill, and that increases the muscle memory pathways and increases confidence, can increase motivation. So we see some benefits to performance, but I think that could also be helpful. Research shows that it is for rehab, so that if they're actually imagining doing their exercises and being successful in their rehab, that can increase motivation, but to actually rehab. But it's also something that while they're not able to practice or be able to do certain skills because of their injury, they're able to, if they're using that time to practice mental rehearsal, seeing it in their head, we think that that has some ultimate benefit for when they return. There's still some muscle memory triggering that's occurring as they're doing that, and can help the transition ease.
It also seems like it would be really psychologically beneficial for the athlete that's injured to think that they're still working on it. Even if their body isn't, then they can still work on their mind. And and just thinking about times when I've been injured myself or unable to be as active in one arena of my life because of a physical thing, then it sort of also is the opportunity to be like, okay, well then I can go develop this area that is, I can read more. It's an opportunity to do more stretching, or, that if you still have a sense of that you're moving forward and you're gaining skills, it can help with that motivation. So I like that. That's interesting. You're using the same skill set that they would be using with their team, but then you're just using it towards the recovery. I'm also curious about this. The few times that I've worked with athletes, what I've been really what kind of shocked me was the degree to which the team was it was almost like the team was their identity over and above their individual. So in the collegiate level, they live with their teammates, their parties are with their teammates, everything is around their team, their social life, time away. Their summers are spent still training, with their teammates in an online kind of way. And so if you are injured, or maybe you're ending your athletic career for another reason, this psychological impact on your whole identity must be completely devastating. I mean, I can't imagine that transition for them.
The word I think of was, it can be really devastating, because especially, with an injury, and depending on what kind of injury it is, but to lose your role on the team, or have that change, and if that was a big source of your worth and self-esteem, and that can, be very difficult to watch somebody else step into that role, and especially if the team, either way, if the team's really successful, or if not, then there can be a great sense of guilt, a great sense of like they're letting the team down in some way, so there can be some shame that they experience, but mostly it's that they're removed from their team, not at practice, and so they don't have that same connection, or even just that same time with their social circle. What do
you do about that? I mean, how do you help people through that?
I mean, we know the research tells us that social support is really important to better recovery outcomes. And so it's one important thing for practitioners to listen for is, where else are they getting other social support? Who else social support? So if they've withdrawn from their team, or sometimes they'll feel like, I can't call my teammates because they'll just feel sorry for me. So they'll be doing their own withdrawing. But then there's the very real withdrawal that happens because they're not able to practice. I try to encourage continuing to go to practice if they can, to continue to attend, team meetings and team functions and things like this if they can. I encourage coaches to try to give them an alternative role within the team, whether that's, could be taking on some kind of leadership in some, but that can be helpful to help them find some way that they're still contributing, or to help them get access to what are their other social networks. And like you said, when you have an injury, it's a time to kind of focus on something else. If you can't do the activity that you were doing before, this is a time for them to expand some of their other interests and spend more time with some of their other social networks, and to create new ones, to get connected with maybe ones that they haven't been able to spend as much time with before.
So it seems like there's a lot of similarities and overlap there in terms of working with somebody with depression or someone that's been through some kind of traumatic event or some kind of life-changing event, of looking at that concept of resilience and how we can move through this and maybe become more flexible and expansive as opposed to isolating and disconnected, and that the isolation is just going to breed more depression, anxiety, worthlessness, feelings of worthlessness, shame, all of that. It's like that vicious cycle down. So yeah, that makes sense. And
I'd love to offer, part of my goal will be to offer some support groups for athletes who are recovering, who are injured. And I've done that in the past in different settings. And there's been some athletes have met that with, oh, that feels really good. Yeah. And they welcomed being able to share their story with other athletes and not feeling quite alone. And then athletes can also be a hard group to get to come to something like that, because then they'd have to, admit some vulnerability and show others that they're struggling with something. And that's not a perspective that's very reinforced within the athletic culture. So that can keep them from seeking out resources.
Right. So kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger, so you have these two special interests around eating disorder and injury, and stepping back and looking at the bigger picture of sports psychology, what are some of the current trends in sports psychology that you're seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing a huge increase in the use of and practice of mindfulness, which, is kind of everything. Discipline. Psychology that's having a big boom in that. And it's funny because research and some books and authors in the past, in the 70s wrote about mindfulness, and it kind of got looked at as, tossed to the side. Now here we are circling back and realizing how important that is. So I think that's just something that I talk to athletes about. This is something that's really great for you, for your overall well-being, for your stress management in whatever situation you are in, and a way to, experience life more fully and be in the present moment. And I also think it happens to have a great benefit to your performance as well. If you're more in the moment, you're less worried about your thoughts, less stuck in overthinking. You can be more automatic in your movements and allow your body to do what it's been trained to do and be able to execute and take risks and play better. So we're seeing just a huge increase in teaching athletes and coaches the importance of mindfulness and how to use that in their, incorporate that into their practices and stuff. And I do think stress management is a really important topic, of course, that we're seeing in general psychology, general health, and is important for athletes. And for the two reasons we've talked more specifically today, that when we know that there's a stress injury relationship, and so that when athletes experience an acute injury, we look back and there tend to be some stressors that they're experiencing in the moment. So if we can help athletes have better coping skills just in life, that will transfer over when they're not as active in their sport, but that would have a great benefit to their sport too. But of course, concussions are a big topic in sport and sports psychology. So I think we're seeing also a big increase in the use of neuropsychologists in sports psychology and working with athletes. And that's really exciting. And just some of the research in neuroscience is really interesting too, and how we're understanding the brain and its impact on performance and concentration and things like that.
Mm-hmm. What would you like to see more of that maybe isn't showing up in current trends?
Yeah, I'd love to see, well, as a field, we have some work to do to be culturally competent. So that's an area I'd love to see more research in. I'd love to see us addressing multicultural dynamics on teams and issues like power and oppression and how that's affecting team dynamics and ultimately experiences, satisfaction, performance. But I think just even with our field, we are not a very diverse group of practitioners. And our research tends to...
You mean sports psychologists are not very diverse group? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think we've been slow to have our research also look at multicultural topics.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk with you and see you and share a cup of tea with you.
So good to see you too. Yeah.
And it sounds like you're doing good work out there in Seattle. Is there anything else that you want to share that I didn't ask you about or put out there about sports psychology or about your work?
I don't think so. I think the only other thing that I would share is that, I think in the future it'll be synonymous with performance psychology, and that's a term that's being used more often to be a little bit broader in scope, because we're, being able to apply the same principles to lots of different kinds of populations that perform. And so that would be artists and musicians and executives and things like that. But a real trend has also been applying some of the same principles that we use with athletes within the military, and then some other high-risk occupations, firefighters, police officers, surgeons, some of those things that have that really high pressure to it. And so I think just as we're trying to increase some clarity about what is sports psychology, I think it's important to say that it's also considered performance psychology, and that can be much broader than just working with the athlete population.
Right. Well, thank you so much again. It's so good to see you, and I wish you a full and vibrant practice there in Seattle, and I hope that we can talk again soon.
Yes, I absolutely look forward to collaborating with you too sometime.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Psychologist Off the Clock. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and iTunes. You can also find us at www.offtheclockpsych.com. That's offtheclock, PSYCH.com. Music by John Gu and Susie Stevens.